Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. On today's episode, the History Guy tells the stories of two New York City riots, both of which began over seemingly trivial issues. First, he tells the story of the Shakespeare riot, when a disagreement over who played the better Macbeth turned deadly. Then he tells the story of the Straw Hat Riots, when fashion and a particularly warm day ended with thousands of hats smashed on the streets of New York City. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
There seems to be kind of a curious gap in the teaching of U.S. history for that period that comes after the War of 1812, but before the Civil War, the period called the antebellum period. And while we don't talk about that period all that much, that period between 1820 and 1860 really largely defined the nation, stretching newfound muscle, the nation's politics, its demographics, its geography, its economy, and its culture transformed radically during that period, offering new opportunities but also new challenges. And the stresses of all those changes seem to come together in May of 1849 in the nation's largest city over the most pressing issue of the day. Who played the best Macbeth? The Shakespeare riot of 1849 is history that deserves to be remembered. The United States experienced enormous growth in the first half of the 19th century. Between 1800 and 1850, the population in the United States more than quadrupled from 5.3 million to over 23 million. While most of the growth was internal natural growth in an area of high birth rates and low mortality rates, as the 19th century progressed, the nation saw an ever-increasing number of immigrants. In the decade between 1820 and 1829, the nation welcomed some 128,000 immigrants. In the decade 1840 to 1849, that number had grown to more than 1.4 million. Many were Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine. Some 60% of those immigrants entered through New York City. The city was growing in a period of rapid urbanization. In 1810, not one city in the United States had a population over 100,000. By 1850, nearly a third of the U.S. population lived in a city with a population over 100,000. The population of New York City was around 80,000 at the turn of the 19th century, but by 1850 it was nearly 700,000. The rapid urbanization was driven by rapid industrialization, creating entirely new economic classes and new economic stresses. One trend of particular note was the growth of a class of the extremely wealthy. In 1844, poet Nathaniel Parker Willis coined the term the upper 10,000. Willis was using the term as a compliment, but the term quickly became a point of contention. While the upper tens represented the opportunity in the nation, John Jacob Astor, the richest man in America and America's first multimillionaire, had made a fortune in the fur trade, but had started in America working in a butcher shop. The measure between the privileged few and the teeming masses was becoming more obvious. A verse from an 1863 song by popular vaudevillian Tony Pastor said, "The upper 10,000 wear jewels and lace, but the lower 10,000 have rags in their place." Meanwhile, industrialization was growing a working class that was benefiting from rising wages and newly found expendable income. In New York, a working class culture grew, epitomized by the so-called Bowery boys and gals. The name derived from the street and neighborhood of New York called the Bowery, which had started as a neighborhood of the wealthy, but by the 1830s was a neighborhood of the working class. While certainly rough and tumble, the Bowery boys and gals were also proud. They developed distinct styles of dress, spoke in a kind of street slang, and had a reputation for being rowdy and boisterous. A European visitor described them. Who are the boys and gals of New York? Sometimes a stout clerk in a jobbing house, oftener a junior partner at a wholesale grocery, and still more frequently, a respectable young butcher with big arms and broad shoulders, in a blue coat with a silk hat and a crape wound about its base. In many ways, they represented the very nature of the brash young nation. They loved independence and freedom, valued loyalty and patriotism, and had a disdain for the aristocracy. They saw the growing trend of immigration as a threat to their wages. They could turn towards violence, and the Bowery Boys was a term for various New York street gangs that were anti-immigrant, anti-Irish, and anti-Catholic, and brawled with other gangs. And one place where the cultures met was at the place where people of all classes sought entertainment and diversion, the theater. In its growth, the U.S. had struggled to develop its own theatrical traditions. There was not yet a quintessential American theater voice. But the character of the theater was changing along with the changing nation. The Bowery Boys were avid but rowdy theater goers. They liked a song or dance, they would demand that the performers repeat it. If they disliked an act, they might hiss or catcall or throw rotten vegetables. In contrast to the more well-heeled clientele, they drank, smoked, and cavorted with prostitutes at the theater. There were various views of this clientele. Frances Trollope, a British author who published her experience traveling in America under the title Domestic Manners of the Americans, decried the incessant spitting and the mixed smell of onions and whiskey. But poet Walt Whitman had a more romanticized view of the noble working-class theater audience, packed from ceiling to pit with its audience, mainly of alert, well-dressed, full-blooded young and middle-aged men, the best average of American-born mechanics. And into this atmosphere came the egos of two of the greatest actors of their times. William Charles Macready was considered perhaps the greatest British actor of his generation, and Edwin Forrest was the first truly American stage star. Growing up in a time when most stage actors in America were British, Edwin Forrest began his theatrical career traveling through rough theaters of the American West, before having great success at the Bowery Theater in New York in 1826. The newspaper The National Advocate said of his performance of Shakespeare's Othello at just the age of 21, "There is not the slightest doubt in our minds, but Mr. Forrest may reach the highest ranks of drama." What set Forrest apart was what the Advocate referred to as natural spirit. He played a more boisterous, robust, and frankly, American version of Shakespeare. A decade later, he was one of the most famous actors in America and seen by many to be the very embodiment of American theater when he traveled to England to perform in the country of Shakespeare. There he found general success, although not universal approval of the British press. And there he also made the acquaintance of William Charles Macready, considered by most to be not just the greatest actor of the day in England, but also in a successful tour in the United States. Macready was complimentary of Forrest, according to the Advocate, even if his supporters in the press were not. The two formed something of a rivalry. When Macready had a second tour of the United States in 1843, Forrest contrived to play in theaters in the same cities, giving audiences, in essence, a choice of the American or the British version of Shakespeare. The rivalry was generally good-natured, and both found success in their tour, even as American papers tended to prefer their native son. The rivalry turned sour, however, when Forrest returned to England in 1845 to less success, especially with his portrayal of Macbeth. Forrest became convinced that Macready and his supporters were conspiring against him. Forrest heckled one of Macready's performances, and the British press turned against him, carrying on an ugly back and forth between Forrest and the editors of the London newspaper, The Times. So when William Macready returned to the United States in 1848 for another theatrical tour, the rivalry was more than just a challenge between the egos of two actors. It was really seen in the United States as representing the challenges of the times. It was a matter of patriotism and pride. Frances Trollope complained that the American working class theater audiences were so patriotic that if Yankee Doodle was called for, they seemed to think that their reputation as a citizen depended upon the amount of noise that they made. It was seen as that contest between nativists and Europeans, and especially the English, the hatred of whom even the Bowery Boys and Irish immigrants agreed upon. It was seen as that challenge between the upper tens and the working class, and the difference between the populist Jacksonian Democrats and their more conservative Whig rivals. The particular bone of contention, it seems, was that Forrest's supporters found it offensive that Macready had failed to invite Forrest to visit his home when he was in England in 1845. Newspapers happily stoked the flames of the rivalry as it sold papers. Forrest supporters promised to hiss Macready off the stage, but found only limited success in places like Boston and Philadelphia, where Macready was still popular enough among theatergoers to receive a civil reception. The Boston newspaper The Bee lamented the rivalry and poor treatment of Macready, even as they opined that we desire to see less art and more nature than Mr. Macready throws into his style. But New York was the center of Forrest's support, and the feud was coming to a head when Macready was scheduled to play Macbeth in what was billed as his last performance in the United States at the Astor Opera House on May 7, 1849. Opened in 1847, the Astor Opera House was intended specifically to exclude the rowdy patrons of Bowery Street. Originally intended to only offer opera, the Astor House's higher ticket prices and strict dress code that required white gloves and evening dress was aiming for an audience of the upper tens. Forrest's supporters bought hundreds of tickets to Macready's performance and attacked him with a wave of hisses and rotten vegetables, while the rest of the audience shouted "Shame, shame" at the rabble-rousers. The actors had to continue the play in pantomime, as the audience could not hear them over the noise. Finally, the theater drew the curtain, as the audience members had started to throw chairs. This was a sorry display, to be sure, but would likely have been written off just as frontier manners, had a group of New York elite, who took the behavior of the mob as an embarrassment to the city, not signed a petition for Macready to complete his engagement, arguing that the good sense and respect for order prevailing in this community will sustain you on the subsequent nights of your performance. Thus, Macready was scheduled for a final performance on May 10th. The situation was not just inflamed by the theatrical rivalry and conflicts of the times. Earlier that year, a Whig, Caleb Smith Woodhull, had won the mayoral election in New York. The Tammany Democrats saw an opportunity to gain political points and embarrass Woodhull by further inflaming the working-class crowd. Tammany supporters distributed handbills asking, "Shall Americans or English rule this city?" The police warned the mayor that they did not have the resources to quell a serious riot, and the mayor mobilized 300 members of the militia. A bloody confrontation was in the works. The night of the performance, more than 10,000 people filled the streets. They attacked the Astor House with bottles and bricks and had running battles with the police. The New York Tribune wrote, "The pieces of bricks and paving stones rattled in on the terraces and lobbies. The confusion increased till Opera House resembled a fortress besieged by an invading army rather than a place meant for the peaceful amusement of civilized community." Then the rioters tried to set fire to the theater. As Macready slipped out the back in disguise, the mayor sent in the militia, afraid of losing control of the city. The crowd, venting the frustration that the poor half of the elite, attacked the militia with paving stones. Still, the mayor and police did not want to order the militia to fire, but the militia commanders explained that they would not just stand to be pelted with stones, and they had to be either allowed to fire or they would leave. Finally, the mayor gave the order. The first volley was fired above the crowd, and when the attacks did not stop, the next volley was into the crowd. The crowd regrouped and continued throwing stones. The militia finally had to bring up their cannon, the threat of which finally caused the crowd to disperse. 18 people were killed in the shooting, many of them bystanders. The Evening Post listed the casualties, included Bridget Fagan, Irish, 30 years old, shot in the left leg just below the knee, lives in 11th Street between Avenues 1 and 2. She was 2 blocks off, walking with her husband on their way home, fell into his arms. And Henry Otten, grocer, corner of Hester and Orchard Street, was shot through the stomach and died in the 15th Street Ward Station House while we were there. His aged mother was present, and her lamentations were truly heart-rending. Several more died of their wounds over the next few days. The New York Herald described the people killed. All were unanimous in that they lived in trying times in a very dangerous neighborhood. More than 50 police and 140 militia had also been injured. The Astor Place riot was the deadliest of numerous riots and insurrections that occurred in New York City during this tumultuous period and resulted in more civilian casualties due to military activity than had occurred in the United States since the Revolutionary War. Clashes between rioters and police continued for a couple of days, but were quelled by the presence of troops. A jury later acquitted the militia of any wrongdoing, arguing that their actions were justified, but 10 instigators of the riot were tried and convicted and served jail sentences. William Macready went back to England and never returned to the United States. He retired from acting in 1851 and died in 1873 at the age of 80. Edwin Forrest continued acting in the United States despite suffering partial paralysis due to gout. He died of a stroke in 1872 at the age of 66. The Astor Place riots had some important and long-term impacts on the United States. For example, New York City police officers were armed more heavily as a result of the Astor Place riots. But the Astor Place never recovered its reputation, became known as the Disaster Place, and it closed, and more upscale entertainment was moved uptown. American popular culture split between highbrow entertainment and entertainment for the working class, like vaudeville, and Shakespeare, which was once so popular among all classes in America that miners in California would stage impromptu Shakespearean plays based on memory, faded from American popular culture.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. So today we're talking about, two riots in New York City, and as we were kind of preparing for the episode, you'd mentioned we haven't even really scratched the surface on New York City riots.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about several, and we could make several episodes on those, but I mean, we haven't scratched the surface. There was, I saw a historian once, and I can't find the quotation again, so I'm not going to be able to attribute the quotation to whoever it was. I hope I don't insult you, but they said essentially every street in New York is soaked with blood. And it's true, and it's interesting, and I think the Shakespeare riot, the Astor Place riot, is a really good example of that. In that McCready and Forrest had been all over the major cities of America on this tour in the exact same circumstances, and nowhere else did it make a riot. I mean, they had some jeers and stuff in other places, but nowhere else did it make a riot. So New York, there's riots. There's plenty of riots in America. There's plenty of riots, I guess, anywhere you go in the world. But New York is kind of unique. It's always been the nation's largest city, and it is a centerpiece of immigration. It's a centerpiece of commerce. It is more than people realize, right in between, actually, North and South. I mean, during the Civil War, the state of New York was very much Union and sent huge numbers of troops. But the city of New York, because they did a lot of trade, was not so clearly in the Union cause. And actually, the proposal by the mayor was to become a free city, and that essentially,
I remember that.
And so. If it's regional, north, south, east, west, that ends up running into it in New York City. If it's racial, whether that's immigration or whether that's black versus white, or that ends up in New York City. If it's economic, whether that's rich versus poor, or that's immigrant or union or non-union, and then of course the politics in New York City too, because for so long it was run by Tammany Hall. It was the example of machine politics. Any stressor that could cause something, and of course, enormous growth very, very quickly. Any stressor, it just seems to be in New York, and so it's the first place that people would riot. And so this is an example of that. I mean, the thing about the episodes, the ones in today's podcast is, how dumb can the reason possibly be to riot? And honestly, today we very frequently, your sports team wins, and so you burn the place. I mean, we can have some pretty bizarre reasons why you would burn your place down today. Yeah. But I mean, over who's the best Macbeth. But I mean, this was a matter of America coming of age. This was a matter of us, the response of America, trying to prove itself versus the UK. Not that long after the War of 1812, by the way. This was also a matter of rich versus poor, about whether the opera houses were supposed to be just the upper tens, or whether everybody gets to go. The whole underlying point to this one is a bit hard to dig through. It does show that, I mean, New York is the place where if there's going to be a fault that's going to lead to a riot, apparently that's going to be New York City. It's just the place where it's most likely to happen.
Yeah. Well, and that's, this particular riot and, this particular episode, I think it does something that I like to do with our history, and I think we do it on the channel a lot, is we take, one event and we are able to kind of extrapolate all these larger these trends and movements and all this other stuff. And so, this gets to be, we get to talk about politics and race and anti-immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, nothing does happen in a vacuum, but I mean, how do you get a riot this big? You can't really get a riot this big over Shakespeare, right? I mean, so there's something else going on that's going to lead to it here. And that's part of the reason to try to understand. It's not just to hear the history of the riot, but to hear, what was going on. That's the reason that we could end up. And I mean, this was no small thing. When they were shooting in the crowd, they finally, the way that the military dispersed the riot was to bring in artillery. And so it's amazing that it wasn't deadlier than it was. But the fact that it turned deadly is crazy. And so, why? I mean, they weren't throwing chairs at the stage, really, because they were mad that the English guy's Macbeth was more muted than the American guy's. I mean, it's not going to lead to this. You can talk about how that was some piece of the overall puzzle of why these two kind of became this, how that becomes the centerpiece of it or something like that. Yeah. A lot of it had to do with class and culture in New York City. We had a growing middle class that were, the upper class really didn't think that they belonged there. And that's really where the conflict was. But also sometimes when you have a growing class like that, then they're a little rough around the edges, and you would say that about the Bowery Boys. I mean, they were, they just saw the world kind of differently, and they were a rowdy bunch, and they were used to going to bars and having bar brawls, and they turned this into that. But it's also,
the rowdiness was clearly a part of it.
Because the two, Forrest and McCready, even didn't apparently have bad blood until Forrest's second trip to London, and over whether when Forrest was in England, did McCready invite him over to his house? I mean, that's the.
It gets a little. You're like, wow, okay, so we're
winds
finding
up with the militia shooting at people in New York City. That is,
because it's one thing. I mean, today we'll have celebrities who we think that this one or that one is, and I mean, you've got the what do they call them, like stans, who will go out and get into, they want to get in the face of the other people's fans on who was in the right or whatever. I mean, we have that stuff, but it is very uncommon that leads to a riot. Not just a couple of people, getting in a fight in a bar, but people, literally the militia being called
call
in.
that. That's very strange. If you look, I mean, we've had plenty of riots in recent U.S. history, but I mean, the things that are leading to the riots that we have today seem more substantive. But on the other hand, our sports riots are probably just as violent as our political riots. So I don't know that we.
Yeah, you see those all over the world too. That's there was like two Rome teams were playing each other, and they were confiscating just absolutely medieval weapons from these people before the game was
absolutely,
over.
Boy,
and
people were soccer, football is people are serious about that, and that's turned into violence lots of times. The crowds take it seriously
all over the place. Yeah, that's been whether you're talking about places in Europe or Latin America, or they're just places where that's taken very serious. But you can't say that the United States has none of that, because again, we have our football
we are kind
teams
of a freewheeling Wild West here, But I mean, and we've had, there's been plenty. There's been straight up modern riots in New York City. I mean, that's they all show what's going on at the time. So it's interesting that some of what was going on, like the Astor Place riot, is the same thing that was going on when they had riots in the '77 blackout. I mean, so you're seeing some of the same sort of stuff that's coming along. And that it keeps coming back. So it is. The point of this one is to say, what's the craziest stuff that you could have an argument? Can you imagine being so mad over a Shakespeare play that you're ripping the chair out of the floor and throwing it at the stage?
It's all, and the class part of it, because they literally stop the one play, and it's like, all right, we're just going to be done. We've gotten through it without a riot, and the upper class, the upper 10,000 writes this letter that says, well, that was so rude of them, and it is, we'll sustain you with our good manners and
make him come back. Yeah, if they just kept their mouth shut and said, go home, there's no reason for this. Fine. But they're like, we want to prove that New York can be civil, and it ends up in a shooting war. That's just that's how things got to wind up, isn't it? And the Astor Place never recovered. It never got back its reputation. Yeah, and part of it was that the Astor Place was trying to be upper tens. It was trying to be, and that seemed to inflame it more. But I mean, there were political motivations involved there too, and it did have to do with the mayor being a Whig, and there were reasons for the Democrats, the Tammany Democrats, to be stirring the pot. And,
and they did, right? I mean, there's certainly reasons that they're trying to stir up the fact that there really was kind of a divide, not I'm sure a clear and perfect divide, but this idea of the Whigs as the more uppity,
they more represented,
and the Democrats as this more working class. That did matter, especially in New York, and of course Tammany was in everything. I mean, they were constantly,
and we're never above throwing a good riot.
Absolutely,
Tammany was never all that anti-riot in their activities over time.
I think that they tended to see a riot as a political.
Yes. What's the line from you? A riot is an ugly thing, and it's about time that we had one.
It's just amazing. It really is truly incredible how all of these things can connect, and how, I mean, to some extent, you can see connections between riots that are, this riot that happened 1849, is that when this was, and modern riots, is that you can.
Well, I mean, we're talking about a riot from 1922, and there's certainly be differences between them, but you also see some similarities. And part of it is just the nature of New York City. They like to throw down. I don't know if that's still true, but I mean, the people of New York are willing to go to fisticuffs relatively quickly, is how it seems.
And there's large groups of different people and people who disagree, and it's easy to build a crowd in New York City, and then that's kind of your first step.
To be fair to New York, this stuff
riot,
happens in other places rioters too. I mean,
Oh
that's
gosh,
one,
yeah. Oh man.
one of the videos is on what the Toronto circus riot. That begins with a clown and a fireman walk into a brothel, and that ends up being a deadly riot. So, and that's in Toronto, which is kind of famously a not sort of city that New York is. It's kind of famously a quiet city.
Well,
so I mean, it's not unique to New York. It's just that New York, it just keeps happening for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
And
for all kinds of reasons. But some of it does have to do with the the unique circumstances of New York.
It does,
but,
absolutely.
Because you even talked,
and you very much here. You're seeing that difference. The Irish immigration. You're seeing a lot of. And that's then you've got nativists that are responding to it. Yep. You've got a political discussion that's going on, and it's always unions. I mean, everything that you can fight over, it ends up being true in New York. So this is one of these where it was really kind of a fight between two different social classes that were in New York, and you can see then why Shakespeare becomes the crux of that, because the question is, does entertainment belong only to the wealthy, or does entertainment belong to the people? And that difference between the is you see that in the difference between Macready and Forrest, and the way that they did Macbeth was indicative of just that different culture between the people that wore white gloves when they went to see Shakespeare and the people that brought onions just in case they needed to throw them. That was.
But it's interesting because we've in so many ways, we've had just an explosion of media since then. Is that there are so many different things that we can watch and do today. We're not limited by, and this was a time when that was much less true. There was simply less.
Yes.
There were fewer options, and so the theater was a place. I mean, that was one of the few.
Yeah, this is right.
Entertainments.
Right. Yeah, this is. And today, we have these fights on social media all the time. I don't know that we're more civil today than we were then. We're just uncivil in a place where we can't actually punch each other. But
well, and people have fights over all kinds of things.
Yeah,
I'm sure people have fights over who plays a better played by more than one person. I'm sure. I mean, Batman, right?
And people have a fight. I like this movie. I didn't like this movie, and they will get really angry over that. And,
sometimes some people have some very strong opinions on that stuff.
It is.
And then you just extrapolate that to everybody's watching the same thing, and everybody has strong feelings about it. And then you mix in politics and nativism, and and before you have a riot.
Because they didn't really even have sport at the time. They didn't have professional sport going on. So this also has. I mean, look at the sport. If you want to know who's really yelling at each other, look at the sports pages. When you have a team that's your team, then there's every reason to make it personal. I mean, we actually deliberately go to do that. And so I mean, all that boils over. But still, I mean, in the end, even when you look at all the reasons for it, the fact that this turned into a riot so large that the National Guard, the militia, had to be called out.
Yeah.
That the militia was being attacked. I mean, deadly attacks with bricks and paving stones. That the militia was either we got to leave or we got to shoot. That they were shooting so randomly into the crowd that a lot of the people that were wounded had nothing to do with it. They were just out strolling in New York and a straight bullet hit them. That they had to bring out artillery. I mean, that all is just, even when you put it all together, all the reasons why you might have fisticuffs over who is the best Macbeth, it is still unique that it would turn into this. And I don't know what would have happened anyplace other than New York. I think really they were spoiling for the brawl before anybody started saying to be or not to be, right? So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the fight had definitely transcended just Shakespeare at that point, right? It was well beyond that. I think that letter where they have him come to make essentially this encore or this full performance. I mean that was a challenge, and that's what the Bowery Boys saw it as. Yeah. They clearly very much said, okay, you think you're so special.
They said, we'll dare you to do it one more time, and they're like, of course we can. We can do that. That's what we do. Yeah. But I mean, it didn't. I mean, in a way, we weren't sort of laughing about it a little bit. But I mean, there's just random people on the street killed, and when you start seeing the names of some of those people, parents or fathers, or a young woman that was just out walking with her boyfriend, they were nowhere near the riot. Might have been at the first shot where they fired over their heads. I mean, those bullets came down somewhere, right? Yeah. And maybe somewhere else in the city, and it's an absolute tragedy that people would die over this, and it's not really clear what lessons they learned, except for we need a bigger police force.
Yeah, and and I don't know. Maybe it's difficult. Certainly, there are difficult issues there. How to control, a mob has
Still don't know.
been a difficulty for. I mean, yeah, that was a difficulty in 1500 BC, and it's a difficulty today. And when I don't think for the most part that anyone wants to turn to deadly force on those, but I also understand why the militia is getting pelted with bricks and rocks. And
we've learned in modern times too. Anytime you have to call the National Guard out for a riot, then there's no good that's going to come from that. I mean,
and people get hurt.
Be extremely violent. Yeah. Luckily, they weren't having to bring out the artillery and threaten them with artillery, but
we don't usually bring cannons. Then it ends up being a little bit of a flashpoint. This particular riot and this period in history where we start seeing kind of. I mean, there's always been to some extent a difference between like lowbrow entertainment and highbrow entertainment, but you would today say that we still have quite a bit of that, and it's interesting how that transitioned. In the mid 19th century when partially when we had the ability for new media and new forms of media to start taking kind of providing entire audiences with new kinds of ways to read and new types of things to read. And I think that, or watch or whatever we're talking about, paperbacks or different vaudeville or something like that. But it's interesting how that's changed. And it's also, Shakespeare was famously in his time, we talk about the fact that it was sometimes difficult to know whether that was lowbrow or highbrow.
That is hard to imagine today. Things I'm exclusively seen as highbrow today, and something you're kind of forced to read in high school, and then people who like Shakespeare, I mean that people were regularly staging Shakespeare plays from memory out when the 49ers were mining out in California. I mean he was the entertainment for everybody, and everybody appreciated his plays. So it's hard to imagine today that I don't know that we count who's the best Shakespearean actor in our time, or if they come and do tours in the same way that they did then. These were superstars, and
it's amazing. If we want to talk about how history changes, these are two names, Macready and Forrest. There, that I think you would have a difficult time finding anyone who would
today
recognize
who
those
were,
names today. Yeah, and that's just talks about the transience of fame. Most people, I mean, there are names we remember from various periods. I mean, most people know, George Washington, but or at least in the United States. I guess I don't know what that. I would assume he's got at least some reasonable fame elsewhere. But it's interesting, how you could be someone who literally was drawing huge crowds, and your portrayal could cause a riot, and we don't even remember your name these days.
So, and I think people here that are selling out, concerts and things like that. We think about that. That is interesting about fame. How long are we going to remember, their names?
Yeah, you wonder. I mean, 100 years from now, does that mean anything, or is that just some name in a dusty old history book? Because I don't think that Macready and Forrest. I mean, they were pop figures. They were not necessarily. They weren't the kinds of people that you're like, no one knew them except people who were really,
everybody knew them at the time. They were the superstars. They were selling out the concert series.
It's just interesting how that is all happens, and how you can see a piece of it in this is that it looks really silly for them to fight over these two guys, for us especially, because we're like, man, who were those guys?
You're right, that we're fighting over people we don't even recognize. I guess we still do that today, and that's always people ask me sometimes. I say, "What are historians going to say about today?" I say, "I don't know. I have to have the perspective of history to see that." So who knows if you look back in the early 21st century and you say, "Why were people doing that?" Do we even remember what the excuse was for that? Because it's hard to figure out the excuse for this one. I'm sure at the time they did. You have to hope, though, that the next morning there were people going like, "Oh boy, that got out of hand." This is not what we wanted.
That's not.
I hope they weren't like,
"Wow,
they were
at least embarrassed."
We got the army out. I hope they were like, "Oh wow, we really maybe shouldn't have done this over Shakespeare."
Maybe that was a little too far. So if you enjoy listening to our podcasts and the YouTube channel, there are lots of different ways that you can kind of support what we are doing and continue to get these forgotten stories and help bring them to light. Some of the ways you can do that are through our pay channels. You can do that on YouTube or Patreon. We also have a
community of locals. Yeah.
And we've also got this thing going on that if you're really interested in history and the History Guy, you can now take a trip with the History Guy.
Take a trip with the history guy. Yeah. This, a couple years ago, we started having this idea: take a trip with the history guy, and that way we get to know some people. And COVID, some stuff got in the way, so we've been able to put together some trips this year. But the trips, 3 of the trips are, 2 are to Germany, 1 is to London. And we knew there were some people who didn't want to travel abroad, and who that was, probably a little bit high on the price point. And so we decided to put together a domestic trip, and that's this trip that's coming up in the Washington D.C. area, March 1st to the 4th. It's going to be done on a coach, so you get yourself to D.C., which is relatively inexpensive to fly to. And when you look at the rate, and we've had some people, but if you look at the rate, that includes all the hotel, it includes most of the meals, it includes the coach, and it includes all the tours. And so it's actually, I think, just a screaming deal to be able to do as much as we're going to do in those few days. So, and the more, if we get more people, we can just get another coach. So, I mean, it's not like the others where there's a cap to it. So registration is available today, and it'll be a great chance. We're going to see things like Mount Vernon and Ford's Theater, and we'll go to things like the Smithsonian and the National Mall, and a lot of stuff that you would typically do if you go to DC. But we'll be able to do it with a group of history lovers. And the history guy. I'll be on the bus with you, and I'll be chatting with everybody, and we'll be doing things in the evening where we can do a catch up. This is just a great way if you want to know me in person, if you want to see what I'm like when we're talking about history, or if you just want to make sure you take, because you can't always do this, that you take a tour with a bunch of people who also love history. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah, that's what I would say about it. I would love to see people there because the audience. I got to read your comments, but I don't really know who's watching the channel, and so it's going to be really fun. It's going to be exciting. It's my first real chance. We've done some events in a couple of places, but my first real chance to get a good smattering of the people who really are History Guy fans and talk to you about what you like about the show, and get your input about the show, and let you get to know me more as a as a person. I'll make this promise to you: is I won't be wearing a bow tie the whole time, but you'll get to see me, with my without the tie on, and be able to have a chat with the
as laid back as the History Guy gets.
Yes, laid back. Taking off my bow ties is about where I go. Yeah.
We are very passionate about history, and I think that's why we do this, and I think that these are the kinds of conversations that we would love to have anyway. And so I think that if you want to find people who are happy to share that interest with you, this is a really good opportunity.
Great way to do it. So all the information that you need is on our webpage, which is www.thehistoryguy.com, and that can show you. That also shows you the Europe trips too. I think we've filled up actually the German trips, but there's still lots of room in the trip to England. We'll be doing other trips in the future too. We're going to kind of see this is the first year. We'll see how these are all going. So we'll have other opportunities too. But I think it's going to be a great time. I think it's going to be great fun if you're interested in joining me March 1st to the 4th. This next year, 2024, so that we can see the great capital of the United States and all the history in the area too. Arlington Cemetery we're going to be to. We'll see the Library of Congress. We're going to go by the National Archives. America's history really is in D.C., and this is going to be our chance to go see it.
Next up, the History Guy talks about the Straw Hat Riots of 1922.
The flat hat that's most often called a boater, but also commonly called a skimmer or a basher, is made from woven Senate straw. The straw is plaited and woven at angles, and the hat is typically the natural straw color, although usually with a wide plain or striped cross-grain ribbon band. Hats are typically slightly elliptical and have a flat crown and a thick flat brim. The style of hat was purportedly based on flat hats worn by sailors. It was invented in the town of Luton in Bedfordshire, which was a center for straw hat making from the 17th century. While the design seems simple, they actually have made many different styles over the years. In 1822, one London shop offered 42 different styles. The Huntington Press of Huntington, Indiana noted in 1922, last year's style saw a predominance of saucer brims. Just what variety will be in favor next year is rather doubtful. The hat was particularly suited to summer, being light but strong, and was commonly worn during summer activities such as boating, thus its most common name. Straw hats did have their difficulty, though. They tended to warp when wet, and as one New Yorker noted in the Daily News in May of 1922, rainy days that required the use of an umbrella all day and cool, blowy days, which often occur during the summer months, are good days to leave the straw hat at home and substitute a soft hat, cap, or derby. Because they used natural straw and were out in the sun, straw hats tended to last only one season before the straw would start to unfurl and the bright ribbon would fade. The hat was first made popular in the first half of the 19th century as a children's hat. By the 1860s, it was being worn commonly by women, but it wasn't until the 1880s that it became popular among men. The hat reached its popularity in a time when it was expected that a man would always wear some type of hat out of doors. What was associated with leisure activities, the boater was actually seen as a semi-formal hat, the summer version of a Homburg. By the turn of the century, straw boater hats were considered an essential part of summer wear, but they were subject to the odd cultural device of fashion rules. Fashion rules are strange things whose origins are often obtuse, but in late 19th century America, the rules were serious. Fashion rules represented class struggles, economic and immigration trends. The people who were in decided what was out, and whether a person wore what was in or out was used as a social measuring stick. For example, while the exact origin of the long-held fashion prohibition against wearing white after Labor Day is unclear, its early enforcement was really a measure of wealth. Wealthy families could afford to escape East Coast cities during the hot and muggy summers, going to the countryside where it was cooler. As cities in the time were filthy for a number of reasons, but especially because of coal soot smoke, it was impossible to keep a white dress clean in the city. Thus, wearing white in summer, while it may have something to do with reflecting heat, was actually a class measure. It separated the wealthy from those poor souls who had to spend summer in New York City. Boater hats had a similar tradition. Felt hats were expected to be worn in the winter and straw hats in summer. This was more than just a matter of practicality. The shift came to be specifically recognized as Straw Hat Day. It's not clear when Straw Hat Day originated, but a 1908 issue of the New York Times opined that straw hats should come with the strawberries. That is, it became appropriate to wear straw hats at the time that strawberries ripened. The op-ed went so far as to opine that New Yorkers who wanted to wear straw hats before what was then recognized as the appropriate day, June 15th, should move south, where strawberries ripened earlier. The rule apparently relaxed, however, with time, as by the mid-1920s, Straw Hat Day in New York was generally recognized to be May 1st, although the official day varied all over the country. There might have been reasons for such a rule, but one was certainly economic. Hat manufacturers knew when to have items in stock, and Straw Hat Day is a genius selling technique, literally a day when people were expected to buy a new hat. But there was the corresponding day in the fall, Felt Hat Day, the day that men were expected to give up their straw hats and shift to felt. By the turn of the century, that day seems to have been generally recognized as September 15th, and was the genesis of a Wall Street tradition. Stockbrokers would traditionally wear their straw hats to work on the trading floor that day, and as a symbolic nod to the end of summer, at the end of the day they would throw their hats on the ground and crush them. Perhaps they were buying stock in hat companies. While some were willing to challenge the rule, the Wall Street tradition became something of a national tradition. If a man was seen wearing the hat after September 15th, someone would snatch it off his head and crush it, a fate that was usually accepted good-naturedly. Still, there were those who questioned the rule. The New York Times editorialized on September 15, 1922, "The origin of this law is obscure. Certainly it's not based on American meteorology. But reflection justifies at least the suspicion that it originated in the dark machinations of the only class that has an interest in its perpetuation." The Times had reason to complain. The city at the time was in the midst of straw hat chaos. The trouble started the evening of September 13th. Although it was 2 days before straw hats were supposed to disappear for winter, it was a particularly hot day, drawing out hordes of late-season skimmers on the streets of Gotham. But the long-worn day also drew out hoodlums, what the Times described as boys and others with undeveloped minds who delight in destruction for its own sake. On the theory that they had the right to declare open season on straw hats on other persons' heads, the paper reported, scores of rowdies on the east side and other parts of the city started smashing other people's hats. If hat smashing seems frivolous, Peter A. Hatting, the aptly named magistrate of the city's men's night court, disagreed. "A man's hat," he explained, "is just as much a man's property and just as much to be defended as a man's watch." The magistrate wasn't just talking theoretically. When a group of youths tried to start smashing the hats of a group of dock workers, the workers fought back. The fighting turned into a brawl which stopped traffic on the Manhattan Bridge. There were dangers of riots breaking out in several parts of the city. Straw hat bonfires were started. Police reserves had to be called out. 7 hat smashers were brought to the night court by police on the night of the 13th. Magistrate Hatting slapped them with stiff $5 fines and threatened to jail the next hat smasher brought in. The threat was intended to send a message. To hit a man's hat, the magistrate declared, is a simple assault, and in this court it will be treated as such. The hope was that the magistrate's strong stand would curb the behavior. It didn't. More hat smashing occurred the following 2 nights. The Buffalo Times observed that the appearance of a straw hat was a signal for rapid entrance of gangs of hoodlums. Gangs of youths attacked hats, and sometimes the owners, if they tried to defend their property. 25-year-old Harry Gerber had to be taken to Harlem Hospital after he was badly kicked and beaten while trying to fight off straw hat vandals. Often the youths would use a long stick with a hooked nail at the end to grab hats right off people's heads. They even lined streetcar tracks using the sticks to knock the hats off passengers as the cars rolled by. One New Yorker reported that the mob of hat smashers along Amsterdam Avenue numbered as much as 1,000. The Tribune declared that the carnival prevailed from the Battery to the Bronx. Even plainclothes police were accosted. The Buffalo Times explained the police were kept busy, but there weren't enough of them, and there were too many hats. The Times reported that, in some cases, hundreds of boys and young men terrorized whole blocks, and lamented that, as soon as police broke up the gangs in one district, the hoodlums resumed their activities elsewhere. Hatting continued his hard stance to those arrested, but many were youths, too young to be tried as adults. According to the Tribune, when police brought 7 boys, all below the age of 15, into the 104th Street station, the lieutenant invited the boys' fathers to come to the station and spank them, and the invitation was cordially accepted. But some were old enough for the magistrate's court. Morris Sikowitz was apprehended by New Yorker Harry Oldbaum, who chased him down after he and a group of hoodlums knocked off his hat. Sikowitz was 16, old enough to be tried in court, and so was charged with disorderly conduct. Hatting fully planned to make good on his promise to jail the next hat smasher brought into his courtroom. Even Oldbaum objected, intervening on behalf of the boy, thinking that a jail sentence was excessive. But it was the appearance of Sikowitz's 70-year-old gray-haired mother that caused Hatting to relent, for her sake, sending the boy home with a fine. But, Hatting declared, I'll send the next one to jail. The unlucky offender was A. Silverman, sentenced to 3 days in jail. The violence quieted after the night of the 15th. New Yorkers seemed to have finally accepted that straw hat season was over. Buffalo Times gave 2 reasons for this. 1, the weather turned noticeably cooler, and 2, most of the straw hats had been destroyed the night before. The street sweepers were said to have been kept quite busy, sweeping up all the broken straw hats. It's hard to divine the underlying cause of the straw hat riots. It might have had something to do with class, but really it might have just been the weather. September 15th was described as a perfect day in New York, which brought out not just a lot of men in straw hats, but also the hoodlums that wanted to destroy them. But a few newspapers did note that the straw hat destruction seemed to occur most in the vicinity of hat stores, which did a brisk business selling felt hats to replace the broken straw hats, suggesting that there might have been some sort of bounty paid to the hoodlums under the table. There were some examples of straw hat violence in subsequent years, but the straw hat riots of 1922, where more than a dozen people were arrested, were by far the worst. Slowly with time, the boater hat fell out of fashion, and that prohibition of September 15th faded. In 1925, President Calvin Coolidge was famously photographed wearing a straw hat all the way on September 20th, perhaps shattering the rule for good.
So, if we thought that rioting over who played a better Macbeth was silly, this riot is potentially ridiculous.
It is, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just even hard to imagine. I mean, first of all, it's just none of it. You don't have any context on this today. People, don't even wear hats. But the idea. I mean, we have ideas of fashion requirements, and I guess there are places maybe that if you wear the wrong clothes or the wrong color, you could get. It's possible that you could run into some sort of violence. But the idea that we have a rule so large that it could lead to a widespread riot over your hat, this is just hard to even put into context.
Yeah, that these were not isolated incidents. This was a legitimate. It drove. I mean, it was literally a problem for New York City. And you're right. There's not really. I mean, these days, we mostly make fun of. I don't think very many people take super seriously the whole don't wear white after Labor Day thing. I think we make fun of that, right? That's the comedy. It's in all kinds of sitcoms. It's a well-known rule, but I don't think it's one that anyone follows. But it's interesting to have these extremely serious rules. And sometimes I wonder, what will someone look back at today and of some rule that we had, or idea that we had that we thought was normal, and this was how things worked, and they'll just think it's just absolutely ridiculous. Because
Oh, that's true. Yeah. I mean, because this is well understood at the time. Well, it was just a few years later. The president's wearing a straw hat later into March, when everyone's like, "Oh, you know what? We don't have to have
this is stupid.
a fight over your." Well, I mean, and it all starts with sort of a game where your buddy's got his hat on, past the time, and so you take it and you throw it on the ground. It was probably going to be thrown away anyway, and then that just gets out of control. So I mean, part of it's New York. It's a very crowded city. It's a city that's growing quickly. There is some of the class warfare going on in here. A lot of this, though, was more the idea of youth versus people that were older and working. The people that were pulling the hats off were mostly juveniles. And at a time, we talked about, there wasn't much to do. In 1922, there wasn't a whole lot to do either. I mean, we joke about our kids being on screens too much these days, but I mean, what did you do before TV?
In 1922, you're just trying to while your days away.
When you had a really hot day in New York City, I mean, what did the kids go do for entertainment? Well, I guess they go pull people's hats off.
Oh, and you can see at first it just seems like this kind of like a harmless prank thing, because it is mere days before probably the day when everyone's going to throw away their stupid hats anyway. The hats don't last more than a season, essentially. You're not usually keeping these things for years and years and years, and so you can see where they're like, oh well, it's hot and this is something we can do. And to be honest, the fact that it was making people mad probably made them want to do it more.
Yeah. I mean, it was clearly a rebellious thing, and it clearly a mob mentality sort of thing. One person's doing it, and everybody starts doing it. And I'm sure that the youth were coming out in the street because everybody was doing it. It was their chance to blow off steam and do some stuff. Maybe they were trying to strike back at wealthy men who walk by them every day, and who seemed to think that they were more important.
And they're like, "Look at your stupid, silly hat!" Like, I mean, although to some extent, they start using like sticks with nails on them and stuff, and I'm like, that does seem like maybe that could get a little dangerous.
You roll by on a streetcar and they hook your hat off. Oh yeah, absolutely. And there were a few injuries. I mean, this one, luckily, the militia didn't fire into the crowd, and I think it came down to a little bit more than a dozen arrests. And there was some brawling that went on. There were
there were some people who got apparently fairly injured, and some people who were fighting over either defending your hat, and then they're like, all right, well, we're gonna beat you up.
Yeah, the magistrate whose name is Hatch is mad, and he's like, I'm going to do this seriously, and it's not as easy to do.
A 16-year-old who is technically old enough to be sent to jail, and
his trial, and he's going to send him to jail. His mom comes in and cries, and so the judge lets him go. And so the next guy, poor guy.
Yeah, right. Well, because ultimately all they're doing is knocking off hats that were probably going to get thrown away anyway. But I also,
well, I mean, he's probably right. It's as much a property as a watch. You don't have a right to do it. And he was going to really try to crack it down, but it's the stricter he got, the more that they misbehaved.
That apparently was not slowing him down.
This obviously was economic too, and it might literally have been that haberdashers were paying kids to go ruin hats.
It's an interesting
to get people to buy hats.
It is an interesting. It doesn't sound like we really have any proof of it, but I mean. You would consider it wily.
It was well suspected at the time. That's all you would say. It was well suspected.
And I can definitely see why the hat people are like, oh, well, we're not really going to get in trouble for that, and it could cost them a couple of bucks or something like that. And then these people are definitely going to buy a new hat because they're all mad about the fact that their old hat was destroyed. But they're not going to go buy a new straw hat.
It's expected if you're outside, you have to have a hat on. So I mean, that's a new thing. But people generally wear hats today, and if people decided that they're going to go pull off, hats,
it would be a problem.
Pull your bill cap off. Yeah, I mean, and so I mean, it's not inconceivable that you could have in a city today you could have with some underlying tension. People decide they're going to pull people's hats off, and then people get into a fight over you pulling the hat off. But I mean, this is when you look at the pictures, and there's like these seas of straw hats. Then you see how it was a much bigger deal at the time, because that was like tearing up your suit. That's part of your outfit. Yep. And they were willing to go to fisticuffs over it. It's one of the most interesting parts is that they decided to try to do that with a bunch of construction workers who were, I guess, a lot different than the Wall Street crowd.
We're less interested in.
So you're having a hat brawl downtown, and the police are quickly overwhelmed, and the street sweepers can't keep up all the hats.
There's just literally so many hats. But when you look at those pictures, you can see them like, gosh, you come in and smash a few hundred of those things. I mean, that's a lot of hats.
It is, that'll make a lot of trash.
And they're.
But I mean, and you could, the whole. You can certainly see how people were surprised that this was going on, and if you read the newspapers at the time, they really were kind of embarrassed that it was going. New Yorkers couldn't believe that people were doing this. But you have whenever you have people that don't have anything to do,
Yeah.
then they will often turn to nefarious means to entertain themselves. And so I guess this was their version of the Shakespeare riot. Was this how they were entertained? I think they were just doing this for fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that just got out of control. But clearly, people saw other people doing it, and it just spread. And what else do they have to do? And I mean, you're right that that is property. And certainly today, if you knocked off almost anyone's hat, knocking off somebody's hat is fighting words. I
think there's a very good chance. So if you just, I mean, I hope we don't give anybody any ideas. But I mean, if you just decided that you're going to get all your friends together and say what we're going to do is go knock everybody's hats off, you could probably get into some. Yeah, maybe there'll be a faster police response. I don't know, but I mean, you could probably turn that into at least some sort of trouble, and that's what
I think the
here.
difference today is for a lot of people that they have other things to do. Honestly, I mean, I think that's part of it's a little bit of that idle hands thing. But I mean, we still have youths who are loiter or do whatever it is that they do.
Yeah, that's true.
They don't seem to they're off being ne'er-do-wells. I think that's been a problem throughout all the time. But certainly we have, your choices aren't really just sit indoors or go knock people's hats off.
Yeah. But, the riots we have today, they seem at least to an extent more. I mean, this seems like it was a lot more, it was completely disorganized. And it was, and it doesn't seem like they were pushing any large political agenda. I think they just thought that this was funny and thought that they could. And, when a bunch of people doing it, then you start thinking that there's going to be no consequences. And then you do that, you have this really weird social convention, and you get a warm day in September, so that more straw hats are out towards the end of September than there should be. But it's just really funny to me that it's within a few years. I mean, they do have some other trouble. They have troubles in other years because you still have this thing where people pull off hats. But, I mean, nothing near the size as it was in 22. But within a few years, they just gave up the convention altogether and said, you can wear your straw hat whenever you want to.
It doesn't matter.
And that's right. All it took was, the president to wear his straw hat in late September for people to go, oh,
maybe.
Wow. Yeah. But imagine that. I mean, I can't quite think of it. I mean, we certainly have sales on President's Day sales or whatever. But I mean, that idea that there's a straw hat day where you're expected to go buy your straw hat, and then you're going to fall hat day where you're expected to go buy a felt hat, and that the vendors or the stores are expecting that. I mean, that's brilliant. I mean,
honestly,
I guess we have like Halloween candy time. I mean, we do buy some stuff seasonally, but I mean that is truly brilliant. Someone should think of that one and bring that back because I mean
right. Just as a marketing thing, I was thinking that too. Is that's an awful lot of hats you sell, and we talk about like planned obsolescence. We should bring back hats. But I mean, those straw hats were clearly one of the reasons why they pushed those hats was like, hey, you got to buy a new one every year, and that means you get to sell a hat every year as opposed to sell one like really high quality hat that's going to last.
It's a very simple hat, and somehow they managed to have every year they would have this is the style.
That's amazing.
How thick the brim was, or whether it was a bump on the brim or anything like that. So I mean that you could take something so simple and that you can turn that into I have to have the latest one. And that pretty much every man is expected to buy a new hat that he's going to wear this season, and then he's going to throw away at the end of the year. It's hard to imagine today, but honestly, someone's missing out if they haven't thought of whatever that you need if you don't need a new hat day, you need
a new something day.
Shoe
something
day.
That's got to be
do something day.
Just a day where everyone goes in and turns in their old shoes and buys new ones or something like that. Because it was brilliant that they were able to do that, and it's interesting how this episode is able to cross all these stories of fashion history, which of course, I mean, as with all pieces of history, matters and is this piece of society and culture that was certainly relevant. And I mean, it couldn't this couldn't have happened without that. And the fact that it was what kind of fashion it was, and this idea that it was so important to all of these older men to wear it. Then for the kids, that you can see the kids looking around and being like, God, this is so stupid. But so
this is clearly a generational thing, it's So you can see shades of that today. You can see shades of the Astor Place riot in the Straw Hat riot, and you can certainly see why riots occurring in New York, how there's some similarity in the sorts of things that would cause social stresses in New York. But yet it's its own thing, and it's a bizarre thing, and it's something that's really hard to wrap your mind around today because we just don't see fashion quite the same way. But I mean, there's red hats today that raise a lot of ire. That's
true.
And those are that cause a lot of emotional response from people, and those I guess those at any time could lead into some sort of. I mean, I think that this could happen today, and I think we'd probably feel it's just as ridiculous.
Yeah, right. I don't think we'd come out of it like, this was a reasonable and good reason for us to get some people beat up. It's just how it turned out, and I don't think that anyone went into this one necessarily with that. I think most of the kids who were doing it thought it was harmless. And
this is like vandalism sort of thing. I mean, they just,
it's also I can see the other side of it where it's like, well, it's not totally harmless. I paid for that hat, and it's my hat. And
it's not. I mean, the judge is right that it's property, and its property has value, and it's no different than stealing a watch. But I mean, I didn't see it that way. They saw it as big tradition that you could ruin a hat. But I mean, this was you could go do something that was clearly misbehaving, but small misbehaving, and make you feel like you've done something rebellious, and some of the people fought over their hats, and some of them didn't fight over their hats. I mean, swinging sticks with hooks with nails on the end at the streetcars just doesn't sound safe.
No, right? I'm like, it's just like that. You've got a nail there that seems like that could rather easily turn into hitting.
Club someone with a nail. Shoot your eye out, kid. Yeah.
and I think we're in some ways fortunate that that this didn't turn into something where some people got injured, but it feels like it could have been worse. Is that you could have gotten some people truly.
It could have. Well, I mean, that's what we saw with the Shakespeare riot, the Astor Place riot, is that the escalation was much worse than the original. This was they stopped at the throwing chairs, at least on this one. It didn't, and maybe that has to do with police response. This this was not as large as New York City riots go. It was nothing like the draft riots or anything like that. But still, I mean, it's a crazy day. It made newspapers all over the country, and it really had people's minds just boggled. Like, why is this going on?
Why does this happen?
And it ended because the weather changed, and because people essentially, if your straw hats were all gone.
How long honestly can it be fun to knock people's hats off? Eventually the kids are going to get bored, right? That's the but you had the warm days, and it gets cool,
and people will stop wearing them because
you're going to get it knocked off and destroyed. And I guess the felt hats must not have been as fun to knock off.
Well, I don't know of any spring riots where they were knocking off felt hats because it was time to buy your straw hat. That didn't seem to appear.
But it is, I just partially you're able to see this and see it as, because it is silly. I mean, it is silly that this is something that people were able to get, honestly, I mean, in fights over. And yet it's also true that throughout human history there's been stuff like that. We had numerous places, we've told numerous stories. I mean, if you talk about the Watermelon War, which is maybe perhaps better described as a riot. I mean, that's something that clearly got
that was certainly it was
crazy out of hand for no reason. I wrote an episode on
the 10-cent beer night riot.
I wrote an episode on the Paris mustache strike, and I think today that the concept that that the mustache was this sign of class that mattered so much that they were I mean they were willing to,
and it turned into strike.
I mean that's.
Well, and the women's smoking ban there in New York City and stuff like that. There are true fights over culture that really do turn into. I mean, they don't always turn into riots, but they do turn into discussions that are.
And we can look back at it now and be like, my God, why would anyone do that for a mustache? But to the guy in 1912 in Paris, that mustache meant a lot more than just than it wasn't just a mustache.
What if you're so poor you can only afford one hat? What if you had to try to save your hat till the next year?
I mean, well, you imagine that some people were like that because it was clearly very important that you wear this hat. As a matter, I remember one of the ads in there said, "Buy yours tonight or lose class." And I mean, they're literally just saying that in the advertisement.
Yeah, you couldn't go to work without.
So you had to get a hat. And so for someone, that was hard-earned money that they maybe would have rather spent somewhere else, but they had to buy the hat. And to us today, we're like, oh, whatever. Why would it have mattered? And I'm like, well, it did matter then, and he didn't want to get made fun of. And there's a reason why people go to work dressed in particular ways and stuff like that. There's reasons for that, and we just don't always see how silly it is until 50 years later, and you look back and you're like, wow, that really was silly. That was that was perhaps less important than I thought it was. Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.